On a May evening in 1542, a man lay dying on a bed of animal skins in a crude wooden shelter on the western bank of the Mississippi River. Outside, the largest river on the continent moved past in silence, its brown waters carrying uprooted trees and dark sediment toward a gulf he would never reach. The man was 42 years old. His body, once among the strongest in the Spanish Empire, had been hollowed by fever until his ribs showed through skin the color of old parchment. 3 years earlier, he had commanded the most formidable European army ever assembled in North America. More than 600 soldiers, 200 horses, packs of armored war dogs, blacksmiths, farriers, priests, and a herd of swine driven ahead of the column like a living commissary. He had marched that army through swamps and mountains and forests and prairies across a distance greater than the width of Europe, searching for gold that did not exist, for cities that were never there, for an empire to rival the one he had helped destroy in Peru. He had found nothing. And now, as his officers gathered around the bed with their hats in their hands, the man who had helped capture the richest emperor in the Americas, who had touched Inca gold with his own fingers and watched it melted into bars, who had returned to Spain so wealthy and famous that the king himself granted him dominion over an unexplored continent. This man owned nothing but the animal skins beneath him and the lie his men would need to maintain after he stopped breathing. They had told the native peoples of this region that their commander was immortal, a child of the sun, a being who could not die. If the tribes discovered the truth, 300 surviving Spaniards would be trapped 1,000 miles from the nearest European settlement with no ships, no route home, and enemies on every side. His name was Hernando de Soto, and in death, as in life, he would be swallowed by the river and the wilderness and the vast, indifferent silence of a continent that had refused to yield its treasures to him. His men would wrap his body in blankets weighted with sand, paddle a canoe to the center of the Mississippi under cover of darkness, and slide him into the current without ceremony or marker. The greatest river in North America became his grave. It keeps him still. The story of Hernando de Soto's expedition through what is now the southeastern United States is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing chapters in the history of European exploration. It is a story of staggering ambition and staggering cruelty, of a man who had already achieved more wealth and fame than almost anyone in the Spanish Empire, and who threw it all away chasing a phantom. It is also inescapably a story of what happens when a military machine built for conquest enters a world where there is nothing to conquer, no centralized empire to topple, no treasury to seize, no single throat to put a sword against. De Soto's expedition did not find gold. It did not establish a single permanent settlement. It did not open a trade route or map a passage to China. What it accomplished with devastating efficiency was the destruction of indigenous societies across a swath of territory larger than Western Europe, leaving behind burned villages, mutilated bodies, and diseases that would continue killing for generations after the last Spaniard had gone. Our understanding of this expedition comes from 4 primary accounts, each carrying its own biases and blind spots. The most detailed is the narrative of a man known to history only as the Gentleman of Elvas, a Portuguese nobleman who accompanied the expedition from beginning to end and wrote his account sometime after returning to Europe. His chronicle is meticulous, observational, and largely unapologetic. He describes atrocities against indigenous people with the same matter-of-fact tone he uses for river crossings and weather reports. Rodrigo Rangel served as De Soto's personal secretary and kept a daily journal that survives in fragments through the work of the historian Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, who interviewed Rangel and incorporated his testimony into a larger history of the Indies. Luys Hernández de Biedma, the expedition's royal factor, essentially the crown's accountant, wrote a shorter, more administrative account focused on distances, resources, and encounters. And decades later, the Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, son of a Spanish conquistador and an Inca princess, composed a sprawling and romanticized history of the expedition based on interviews with survivors, a narrative that burnished De Soto's reputation, but preserved details found nowhere else. Between these four voices, the anonymous nobleman, the secretary, the accountant, and the mestizo historian writing from memory and secondhand testimony, we can reconstruct with considerable confidence the trajectory of 4 years that changed a continent. To understand what drove Hernando de Soto across an ocean and into the unmapped interior of North America, you must first understand where he came from and, more importantly, what he had already seen. He was born around the year 1500 in Jerez de los Caballeros, a town in the Extremadura region of western Spain. Extremadura. The name itself means beyond the Douro, the hard land, the far edge. It was a region of sparse oak forests and rocky pasture land, of crumbling Roman walls and Moorish fortifications, of families who had been poor for so many generations that poverty had hardened into a kind of identity. The soil yielded little. The summers were brutal. Dry heat that cracked the earth and turned the rivers to trickles of warm mud. The winters brought a cold that seeped through stone walls and settled in the bones. Extremadura was, by the early 16th century, the most reliable factory of conquistadors in the Spanish Empire. Hernán Cortés came from Medellín, 30 miles to the northeast. Francisco Pizarro came from Trujillo, even closer. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the first European to see the Pacific from the shores of the Americas, came from Jerez de los Caballeros itself, the same town where de Soto was born. The pattern was not coincidental. These were men raised in a landscape that offered nothing and taught them through the accumulated weight of generations that whatever they wanted in life would have to be taken from somewhere else. De Soto's family occupied the uncomfortable middle ground of Spanish provincial society, hidalgo status, meaning minor nobility, which conferred a title and certain legal privileges but almost no wealth. His father held land but not enough to generate real income. The family name opened doors but could not furnish the rooms behind them. Young Hernando grew up surrounded by the trappings of status without the substance, watching his father maintain the posture of a gentleman while struggling to feed a household. It was a particular kind of humiliation, common to declining families across Extremadura, and it produced in boys like Hernando a hunger that was less about money than about proof. Proof that they were what their names claimed them to be. Proof that mattered in a way that a crumbling estate and an empty title did not. He was, by all accounts, physically impressive from an early age, tall for his era, lean, with a natural athleticism that expressed itself in horsemanship and swordsmanship before he was old enough to have received formal training in either. The Gentleman of Elvas would later describe him as a man of excellent disposition and bearing, skilled above all others in the exercises of war. Garcilaso de la Vega, writing decades after the fact and prone to embellishment, nonetheless captured something true when he described de Soto as a man who seemed born to the saddle, who handled a lance with the ease that other men handled a walking stick. These were not merely physical gifts. In 16th century Spain, martial prowess was the currency of social mobility for impoverished hidalgos. A strong arm and a steady seat on horseback were not hobbies. They were a business plan. At the age of 14, Hernando de Soto left Extremadura for the New World. The specific circumstances of his departure are unclear. Garcilaso claims he was sponsored by a wealthy patron named Pedro Arias Davila, known as Pedrarias, one of the most powerful and ruthless governors in the early Spanish colonies. What is certain is that by 1514, de Soto had crossed the Atlantic and arrived in the Darien region of what is now Panama, stepping into a world that bore no resemblance to the dry, orderly landscapes of his childhood. The Darien was a wall of green, jungle so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor only in scattered coins of gold, a cruel metaphor for the treasure that drew men here. The air was thick enough to chew, saturated with moisture that bred mosquitoes in clouds and rotted leather and rusted steel within weeks. Men died of fever before they ever drew a sword. They died of snakebite, of infected wounds that turned gangrenous overnight in the tropical heat, of parasites that burrowed into their skin and laid eggs in their organs. The Darien killed Spaniards with casual efficiency, and it did not care about their titles or their ambitions or the royal charters they carried in waterproof cases. De Soto survived. More than survived, he thrived. Where other young men crumbled under the physical punishment of colonial soldiering, De Soto seemed to absorb it, to metabolize hardship into capability. He learned to read jungle terrain the way he had once read the rocky pastures of Extremadura, identifying the hidden paths, the dangerous crossings, the places where an ambush might come. He learned the particular cruelty of colonial warfare, the night raids on indigenous villages, the use of war dogs to terrorize populations into submission, the casual enslavement of captured people as porters and guides and objects of barter. He learned, too, the political dynamics of the colonial world, how alliances shifted, how governors rose and fell, how a young man with military talent and flexible morality could attach himself to the right patron and ride that connection upward. Under Pedrarias, De Soto participated in expeditions through Central America, into modern-day Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. He proved himself repeatedly in combat, earning a reputation as one of the most capable cavalry commanders in the colonies. He was given command of troops while still in his early 20s, an honor reserved for men who had demonstrated both martial skill and the willingness to exercise the kind of authority that colonial warfare demanded. This was not the chivalric warfare of European tradition. There were no rules of engagement, no codes of honor applied to the indigenous enemy. Villages were burned as a matter of routine. Captives were branded and distributed as property. Chiefs who resisted were hanged or fed to the dogs. De Soto did not invent these methods, but he employed them without hesitation, and he was rewarded for his efficiency. By his late 20s, Hernando de Soto had accumulated considerable wealth and a reputation that stretched across the colonial world. He was known as a superb horseman, a fearless soldier, and a commander who inspired loyalty through a combination of personal courage and generous distribution of plunder. He was also known as a man whose ambition had not yet found its proper scale. Central America had made him rich, but rich was not what he was after. Rich was what his father had failed to be. It was a solved problem, an answered question. What De Soto wanted was something larger, something that would carve his name into history alongside the great conquerors. He wanted an empire, and then in 1532, he found one. The conquest of Peru is one of history's great asymmetries, a story so improbable that it sounds like fiction, and so thoroughly documented that its reality is beyond dispute. Francisco Pizarro, a fellow Extremaduran who had spent decades in the colonies, received royal permission to explore and conquer the western coast of South America, where rumors spoke of a vast empire dripping with gold. Pizarro assembled a force of fewer than 200 men and sailed south into the unknown. De Soto, by this time a seasoned officer with his own command and his own fortune, joined the expedition. His motives were transparent. Pizarro was going after the biggest prize in the Americas. De Soto intended to be there when it was taken. What they found exceeded anything the rumors had promised. The Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, stretched nearly 3,000 miles along the spine of the Andes, from modern-day Colombia to Chile. It governed a population of perhaps 12 million people through a system of roads, relay stations, and administrative centers that rivaled Rome's. Its temples were sheathed in gold. Its emperor, the Sapa Inca, was worshipped as a living god, and when the Spanish arrived, the empire was tearing itself apart. A civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, had divided the Inca military and created a fracture that Pizarro exploited with ruthless brilliance. In November 1532, at the highland city of Cajamarca, Pizarro lured Atahualpa into an ambush that remains one of the most audacious military actions in recorded history. The Sapa Inca arrived with an entourage of thousands, carried on a golden litter, surrounded by nobles and attendants in ceremonial dress. The Spanish, hidden in buildings around the central plaza, opened fire with cannons and arquebuses, then charged on horseback into the stunned crowd. The massacre lasted less than 2 hours. Thousands of Inca attendants and warriors were killed. Not a single Spaniard died. Atahualpa was pulled from his litter and taken prisoner. De Soto was in the middle of it. The Gentleman of Elvas and other sources place him among the cavalry that charged into the plaza, his lance driving through the packed bodies of the Inca retinue. But his most significant role came before the massacre, in the days of diplomatic maneuvering that preceded it. Pizarro had sent De Soto, along with his brother Hernando, to meet Atahualpa in his camp outside Cajamarca. It was De Soto who rode his horse directly at the Sapa Inca in a display of intimidation, a cavalryman's charge that stopped inches from Atahualpa's face. The Inca emperor did not flinch. Several of his attendants did, and Atahualpa reportedly had them executed that night for displaying cowardice. The encounter told each side something important about the other. Atahualpa learned that the Spanish were aggressive and unpredictable. De Soto learned that the man sitting on the golden stool possessed a self-control and authority that made him the most dangerous person in Peru. What followed the capture of Atahualpa was the most spectacular ransom in human history. The Sapa Inca, understanding that the Spanish wanted gold above all things, offered to fill a room measuring approximately 22 feet long by 17 feet wide with gold to the height of his raised hand, roughly 8 feet, and to fill an adjacent room twice over with silver. Pizarro accepted. Over the following months, gold and silver poured into Cajamarca from every corner of the empire. Temple walls were stripped, sacred objects were melted down, works of art that had taken generations to create were reduced to ingots. The room was filled, the ransom was met. And then Pizarro had Atahualpa executed anyway, garroted in the plaza of Cajamarca in July 1533, his death a lesson in the value of Spanish promises. De Soto received one of the largest shares of the ransom, by some accounts the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern currency. He had opposed Atahualpa's execution, not out of mercy, but out of pragmatism. A living emperor was a more useful tool for controlling the population than a dead one. This disagreement with Pizarro created a rift between the two men that would widen over the following months. De Soto watched as Pizarro consolidated control over Peru, installing puppet emperors and distributing land and labor to his supporters. De Soto received his share, but he understood that in Pizarro's Peru there was room for only one conqueror. The kingdom belonged to the Pizarro family. Everyone else, no matter how much gold they held, was a subordinate. This understanding, that wealth without sovereignty was merely a more comfortable form of servitude, became the engine that would drive Hernando de Soto for the rest of his life. He had stood in the room where the ransom gold was counted. He had run his fingers through treasure that would have sustained the economy of a European nation. He had watched an empire fall in a single afternoon, and he had seen with absolute clarity that the man who commanded the army commanded everything, while the men who merely served in it commanded only what they were given. De Soto did not want to be given things. He wanted to take them. He wanted his own Cajamarca, his own golden room, his own empire kneeling at his feet. He returned to Spain in 1536, and his arrival was a spectacle. The Peruvian conquest had made him one of the wealthiest men in the country, and he spent lavishly at magnificent horses, fine clothing, a retinue of servants that announced his status before he opened his mouth. He was received at court by King Charles V, who recognized in De Soto exactly the kind of man the empire needed, proven in battle, self-funding, and willing to risk his own fortune on expansion. De Soto married Isabel de Bobadilla, daughter of his old patron Pedrarius, cementing his social position with a union that linked two of the most prominent conquistador families in the colonies. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had won. He had escaped Extremadura, survived the Darien, enriched himself beyond calculation in Peru, and returned to Spain as a hero. A reasonable man would have stayed, but reason had nothing to do with what drove Hernando de Soto. The gold from Peru, staggering as it was, had taught him something that could not be unlearned. It had taught him that somewhere, beyond the edge of every map, there was always another empire. The Aztecs had been found in Mexico, the Inca had been found in Peru. The logic of the age insisted that the pattern would continue, that the vast, unexplored interior of North America must contain its own civilization, its own cities of gold, its own temples waiting to be stripped. The rumors were specific and enticing. Survivors of previous failed expeditions to Florida and the Gulf Coast spoke of wealthy kingdoms in the interior, of cities where the buildings gleamed and the rulers wore gold ornaments. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who had spent 8 years wandering across the continent after a shipwreck, brought back stories of prosperous settlements and abundant resources that grew more golden with each retelling. De Soto listened to these stories the way a man dying of thirst listens to the sound of water. He did not analyze them critically. He did not weigh the evidence or consider the possibility that the rumors were exaggerations born of desperation and wishful thinking. He heard what he needed to hear, that there was another Peru out there waiting to be claimed, and that the man who claimed it would stand alongside Cortés and Pizarro in the pantheon of conquerors. In 1537, he petitioned Charles V for the right to conquer, pacify, and settle the lands of Florida, a term that, in the Spanish usage of the era, encompassed the entire southeastern portion of North America. From the Atlantic coast to an undefined western boundary, the king granted the request. De Soto was appointed governor of Cuba and adelantado of Florida, titles that gave him legal authority over a territory he had never seen and that no European understood. In exchange, De Soto agreed to finance the expedition himself, to establish at least 3 towns within 4 years, and to deliver the crown its customary share of any treasure discovered. The contract was structured like a business deal between the crown and a private military contractor. The risk was entirely De Soto's. The potential reward was sovereignty over an area larger than Spain itself. He spent the better part of 2 years preparing. The expedition he assembled was unprecedented in scale for North American exploration. More than 600 soldiers recruited from across Spain and Portugal, many of them veterans of European wars or colonial campaigns. Over 200 horses, war horses bred and trained for combat, worth more than most soldiers' annual wages. Packs of war dogs, mastiffs and greyhounds trained to attack on command. Animals that had been used with devastating effect against indigenous people throughout the colonies. Blacksmiths to repair weapons and shoe horses, farriers, priests to minister to the soldiers and theoretically to convert the natives, notaries to document legal claims, servants, enslaved people, and camp followers whose exact numbers went unrecorded, and a herd of pigs, several hundred of them, driven alongside the column as a self-replenishing food supply, an innovation that would prove more consequential than anyone realized, as the pigs would introduce European diseases into indigenous communities long before the soldiers arrived. The fleet sailed from Havana in May of 1539, 9 ships carrying this enormous force across the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico toward the western coast of Florida. De Soto stood at the rail of his flagship as the low green line of the Florida coast materialized on the horizon. He was 39 years old. He was risking everything, his fortune, his reputation, his life, on the conviction that the interior of this continent held treasure comparable to what he had found in Peru. He had no way of knowing that the land before him contained no gold, no silver, no jeweled cities, no centralized empire to topple, and no treasure of any kind that a 16th century Spaniard would recognize as wealth. He had no way of knowing that the next 4 years would strip him of his army, his health, his certainty, and finally his life. He had no way of knowing that the greatest river on the continent would become not his highway to glory, but his unmarked grave. The boats made shore near present-day Tampa Bay on the last day of May 1539, and the men began unloading horses and supplies onto a beach of white sand backed by dense stands of mangrove and palm. The air was thick with moisture, heavy and warm in a way that pressed against the skin like a wet cloth. Insects rose from the marshes in clouds so dense that horses snorted and shook their heads, and soldiers wrapped cloth around their faces and still breathed in mosquitoes with every inhalation. The beach was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful. White sand, blue water, green jungle pressing close to the tide line. But the beauty was a mask over terrain that would prove murderous. Behind the mangroves, the land dissolved into a labyrinth of swamps, rivers, and dense subtropical forest where visibility dropped to a few yards and a man on horseback. The Spanish military's supreme tactical advantage was useless. Within days, De Soto's scouts made contact with a man who would briefly become one of the most important figures in the expedition. Juan Ortiz was a Spaniard who had been part of an earlier expedition to Florida, led by Panfilo de Narvaez, which had ended in catastrophe over a decade earlier. Ortiz had been captured by a local chief and had lived among the indigenous people for 12 years. He spoke the local Timucua language fluently. He understood the geography, the political structures, the relationships between tribes. He was, in short, exactly the kind of asset that De Soto needed: a translator, a cultural interpreter, a man who could bridge the vast gulf between the Spanish military mind and the indigenous world it was about to invade. Ortiz told De Soto what lay ahead. He described the interior: dense forests, wide rivers, settlements of varying size ruled by chiefs of varying power. He described the people: complex societies organized into chiefdoms, some allied with each other, some at war, all of them aware that strangers had come before and brought death with them. What Ortiz did not describe, because it did not exist, was an empire of gold. He did not speak of jeweled cities or treasure houses or a centralized kingdom waiting to be seized. But De Soto heard what he wanted to hear. The large settlements Ortiz described became, in De Soto's mind, the outer provinces of a wealthy kingdom. The powerful chiefs became governors of rich domains. The cultivated fields and storage granaries became evidence of surplus wealth that must logically flow from gold and silver mines somewhere deeper in the interior. The pattern was set in those first days on the Florida coast. De Soto would ask questions designed to confirm what he already believed. Translators, first Ortiz, later a chain of captured indigenous people forced into service, would provide answers that De Soto would interpret through the lens of his experience in Peru. Every large settlement was a potential Cusco. Every powerful chief was a potential Atahualpa. Every rumor of rich lands to the north, to the west, always just beyond the next river or the next mountain range, was confirmation that the empire was close, that the gold was near, that the next valley would reveal what 4 years of marching never would. The army moved north from Tampa Bay into the interior of Florida, and the nature of the expedition revealed itself immediately. De Soto's method of travel was simple and brutal. He would arrive at an indigenous settlement, seize the chief, and inform the chief, through whatever chain of translators was available, that the Spanish required food, porters, women, and guides to the next settlement. If the chief cooperated, the village was merely stripped of its resources. If the chief resisted, the village was burned, and the resistors were punished in ways designed to terrorize neighboring communities into compliance. Hands were cut off, noses were removed, war dogs were unleashed on captives while soldiers watched. The message was calibrated for maximum psychological impact. Cooperate or suffer, and the suffering will be beyond anything you can imagine. This was not random violence, it was a system. The same system that had been refined across decades of colonial warfare in the Caribbean, in Central America, in Peru. De Soto had learned it under Pedrarias. He had perfected it under Pizarro. The logic was straightforward. A small army, outnumbered many times over by the indigenous population, could maintain control only through terror. If every village knew that resistance meant the destruction of everything and everyone within it, most villages would choose submission. The system worked. It had worked in Peru, where 168 men had toppled an empire of 12 million. De Soto saw no reason it would not work here. But here was not Peru. And that difference, unrecognized by De Soto, invisible to a man whose entire frame of reference was built on the Inca conquest, would prove to be the fundamental miscalculation of his life. The Inca Empire had been a centralized state. It had a capital, Cusco, where power was concentrated, It had a single ruler whose capture paralyzed the entire system. It had a network of roads and storehouses that an invading army could seize and use for its own supply. It had, crucially, a treasury. Physical rooms filled with physical gold that could be physically taken. The conquest of Peru had been, in a sense, a decapitation. Cut off the head and the body collapsed. Pizarro had understood this with predatory clarity, and De Soto had watched it happen, had internalized the lesson so deeply that it became the only lens through which he could see the world. The southeastern interior of North America offered none of these things. The indigenous societies De Soto encountered, the Timucua, the Appalachia, the various Mississippian chiefdoms that dominated the river valleys, were organized as independent or loosely affiliated polities. There was no single capital to capture. There was no emperor whose seizure would cause a continent to kneel. Power was distributed across dozens of chiefdoms, each with its own chief, its own warriors, its own territory, its own alliances and enmities. Conquering one village meant nothing to the village 20 miles away except that a dangerous enemy was now 20 miles closer. The Spanish could not decapitate what had no single head. They could not seize a treasury that did not exist in the form they recognized. They could burn a village, but the people would melt into the forests and rebuild. They could capture a chief, but his authority extended only to his own people, and his capture did not unlock the submission of his neighbors. De Soto was fighting the last war. He was applying Peruvian tactics to a landscape that was not Peru, and the landscape refused to cooperate. The army pushed north through Florida during the summer of 1539, and the heat was a living adversary. The Gentleman of Elvas described days when the air was so heavy with moisture that men felt they were breathing water. Armor that had been designed for the dry battlefields of Spain became an instrument of torture in the subtropical humidity. The metal heated in the sun until it raised blisters on the skin beneath the padding, and the weight of a full harness drained a soldier's strength within hours. Horses suffered as badly as men, their heavy bodies struggling through swamps where the footing was treacherous, and the water sometimes rose to their bellies. The column stretched for miles through the forest, the soldiers at the rear unable to see the vanguard. Communication reduced to shouted orders that the dense vegetation swallowed before they traveled 50 yards, and the indigenous people fought back. Not in the pitched battles that De Soto wanted, battles where Spanish cavalry and steel weapons would have produced the same lopsided massacres that had characterized the conquest of Peru, but in ambushes, skirmishes, and night raids that exploited every disadvantage of the Spanish position. Warriors appeared at the edges of the column, fired arrows with devastating accuracy, and vanished into cover before the cavalry could respond. Arrows found gaps in armor, the joints at the elbow and knee, the space between helmet and gorget where the neck was exposed. The cane bows used by the indigenous warriors of the southeast were powerful enough to drive an arrow through chainmail at close range, a fact that stunned soldiers accustomed to thinking of their armor as impenetrable. Horses, the largest and most visible targets, were shot with a consistency that suggested the indigenous fighters understood exactly where the Spanish advantage lay and were systematically dismantling it. The army reached the territory of the Appalachia in the fall of 1539, and here De Soto made the decision to winter. The Appalachia were among the most formidable societies in the region. Their territory, centered around what is now Tallahassee, was rich agricultural land producing surplus corn, beans, and squash. De Soto seized the principal town of Anhaica, drove out or enslaved its inhabitants, and installed his army in the existing structures. For 5 months, the Spanish occupied Appalachia territory, eating food that had been grown and stored by the people they had displaced. It was during the winter at Anhaica that the first real fractures appeared in the expedition's morale. The soldiers had signed on for gold. They had watched De Soto spend a fortune assembling this army, had heard his promises of wealth that would rival Peru, had crossed an ocean on the strength of his reputation and his confidence. 5 months into the expedition, they had found nothing but swamps, hostile warriors, and villages that contained corn but no treasure. The Gentleman of Elvas records grumbling among the men, whispered conversations about whether the governor was leading them deeper into a wilderness that had no gold to find. Some soldiers deserted, slipping away from the camp at night to make their way back toward the coast, hoping to find the supply ships that maintained a tenuous connection with Cuba. Most of these deserters were recaptured. De Soto dealt with them harshly, understanding that in an army held together by the promise of future wealth, desertion was a contagion that could destroy the entire enterprise. He dealt with the Appalachians harshly as well. Rangel's account describes a pattern of escalating violence. Chiefs were seized and held as hostages to ensure the cooperation of their people. When warriors continued to attack Spanish foraging parties, De Soto ordered captives mutilated, hands and noses cut off, the maimed survivors released to carry the message back to their communities. The war dogs were used with increasing frequency. The heavy mastiffs turned loose on captives in spectacles that served simultaneously as punishment and entertainment for soldiers whose morale needed sustaining. The violence was not incidental to the expedition. It was structural, woven into the daily operation of a military force that depended on terrorized indigenous labor for its food, its porters, and its guides. When the army broke camp in the spring of 1540, De Soto turned north, then northeast, driven by reports from captured indigenous people who told him, under duress, through chains of translators whose accuracy was unknowable, that wealthy chiefdoms lay in that direction. The expedition entered what is now Georgia, moving through a landscape that was changing. The subtropical swamps of Florida gave way to rolling Piedmont forests of oak and hickory, open enough in places for the cavalry to maneuver, dense enough in others to channel the army into narrow paths where ambush was always possible. Rivers crossed the route with frustrating regularity: the Flint, the Ocmulgee, the Oconee, the Ogeechee, each one requiring days of labor to bridge or ford, each crossing a moment of vulnerability when the column was split between banks and an attacking force could have destroyed either half. The chiefdoms of Georgia received the Spanish with a range of responses that reflected the complexity of the indigenous political landscape. Some chiefs, warned by refugees from Florida about what the Spanish had done to the Appalachians, chose a strategy of apparent cooperation, providing food and guides and porters while secretly sending runners ahead to warn neighboring chiefdoms. Others resisted immediately and paid the price. Still others attempted diplomacy, greeting De Soto with ceremony and gifts, hoping that generosity might persuade the strangers to move on peacefully. De Soto accepted every gift and every gesture of friendship, then demanded more. More food, more porters, more women, more information about the wealthy kingdoms that must surely lie just beyond the horizon. It was in this region that De Soto first encountered the chiefdom of Cofitachequi, a polity centered in what is now South Carolina, and the encounter would become one of the most revealing episodes of the entire expedition. The army had been marching for nearly a year. Supplies brought from Cuba were long exhausted. The soldiers subsisted entirely on food seized from indigenous communities, and the army's passage through any territory left a wake of depleted granaries and ruined fields. Morale was deteriorating. The promised gold had not materialized. The interior of the continent was vast and disorienting, an endless succession of forests and rivers and settlements that blended together, each one a variation on the last, none of them remotely resembling the stone cities and treasure houses of Peru. Soldiers were dying, not in great battles, but in the slow, grinding attrition of disease, infected wounds, ambush casualties, and accidents. Each death reduced the army's fighting strength by an increment that could not be replaced, and each death reminded the survivors that they were moving deeper into a territory from which retreat was becoming increasingly difficult. Then word reached De Soto of a powerful female chief who ruled a territory to the northeast, a woman, the accounts emphasize, who governed in her own right and whose domain was said to be wealthy and extensive. The army turned toward Cofitachequi with renewed energy. For De Soto, a powerful ruler meant a powerful kingdom, and a powerful kingdom meant the wealth he had been seeking. The equation was automatic. a reflex born in the blood-soaked plaza of Cajamarca. The meeting, when it came, was unlike anything the expedition had experienced. The Lady of Cofitachequi, her personal name was never recorded by the Spanish chroniclers, an erasure that speaks volumes about what they considered worth preserving, crossed a river to meet De Soto in a canoe draped with white cloth. She was carried ashore on a litter. She greeted the Spanish commander with elaborate ceremony, removed a strand of freshwater pearls from her own neck and placed them around De Soto's. She provided food, shelter, and guides. She opened her territory to the strangers with a grace and diplomatic skill that impressed even the chroniclers, men not generally inclined to admire indigenous leaders. De Soto was delighted, but not by the diplomacy. His soldiers had discovered in a mortuary temple near the principal town of Cofitachequi a quantity of freshwater pearls that was, by all accounts, enormous. Biedma, the royal factor whose job was to assess the value of discoveries, estimated the pearls in the hundreds of pounds. They were stored in the temple alongside the remains of honored dead, their iridescence dulled by exposure and by the smoke used in the mortuary rituals. European pearl merchants would have found them damaged, their commercial value reduced. But to De Soto's men, after a year of finding nothing, the pearls were the first tangible evidence that this continent might yield something worth the suffering it had cost them. De Soto seized the pearls. He also seized the Lady of Cofitachequi herself, taking her hostage and forcing her to accompany the army as it continued its march. The same tactic he had used and seen used throughout the colonies, the capture of a leader as insurance against resistance by her people. The lady endured this captivity with a composure that the chronicles note but do not examine. She marched with the army for weeks, her dignity intact, her silence a rebuke that the Spanish seemed unable to hear. And then, somewhere in the mountains of what is now western North Carolina, she escaped. She slipped away from the column carrying a box of the finest pearls, the ones De Soto had set aside for himself, and disappeared into the forests. The Gentleman of Elvas records this with obvious irritation at the loss of the pearls. The loss of the woman herself merits barely a sentence. The episode at Cofitachequi crystallized everything about De Soto's expedition. Here was a sophisticated, diplomatically skilled leader who offered cooperation and friendship. De Soto took her hostage. Here was a treasure of genuine value, pearls that could have funded the next stage of the expedition. De Soto treated them as confirmation that greater wealth lay ahead. Here was a territory that could have served as a base of operations, a place to establish the permanent settlement that De Soto's charter required. De Soto marched through it and kept going, always moving, always searching, always certain that the real treasure was in the next valley, the next chiefdom, the next territory beyond the horizon. The pattern had become pathological. He was no longer exploring. He was fleeing the possibility that the gold did not exist, that the empire he sought was a fantasy, that he had wagered everything he had on a continent that had nothing to give him. The army crossed the Appalachian Mountains in the summer of 1540, entering a landscape of dense hardwood forests and narrow valleys where the rivers ran cold and clear over beds of stone. The mountains were not the Andes. They lacked the killing altitude and the stark grandeur of the Peruvian highlands, but they were difficult enough to slow the army to a crawl. Pack animals slipped on steep trails. Supply chains stretched to the breaking point. The indigenous people of the mountain region, ancestors of the Cherokee, watched the column pass through their territory with a wariness that stopped short of confrontation but never approached welcome. On the western side of the mountains, the landscape opened into the rich river valleys of what is now Alabama, and it was here that Hernando de Soto would face the most devastating military engagement of his life. The paramount chief of the territory was a man named Tuscaloosa, a towering figure who, according to the Gentleman of Elvas, was so tall that he seemed a giant among his own people. Tuscaloosa ruled a powerful chiefdom in the Black Warrior River Valley, and he understood from the accounts of refugees and runners who had preceded the Spanish by weeks exactly what De Soto's arrival meant. He understood the pattern, The seizure of chiefs, the demand for food and porters, the violence that followed resistance. And he decided with a strategic sophistication that the Spanish would not fully appreciate until it was nearly too late, to use De Soto's own methods against him. Tuscaloosa received De Soto with ceremony, meeting the Spanish commander while seated on a raised platform, his bearing conveying authority and composure. He agreed to De Soto's demands, food, porters, women, and told the governor that all of these things could be found at a town called Mabila, several days' march to the south. He would guide the Spanish there himself. De Soto, interpreting Tuscaloosa's cooperation as submission, took the chief into the army's custody and turned south toward Mabila. What De Soto did not know, what his translators either could not or did not tell him, was that Tuscaloosa had spent weeks preparing. Runners had carried his orders to chiefdoms across the region. Warriors had been gathering at Mabila in secret, concealed within the walls of the fortified town and in the forests surrounding it. Mabila was a trap, carefully prepared and patiently baited, and De Soto was walking his army directly into it. The town of Mabila was a fortified settlement enclosed by a wooden palisade, a wall of heavy logs driven into the earth and lashed together high enough and strong enough to resist a direct assault. Inside the walls, according to the Spanish accounts, thousands of warriors waited. The exact numbers are disputed. The chroniclers, writing after the fact and inclined to inflate the enemy's strength to magnify Spanish valor, claim figures ranging from several thousand to tens of thousands. What is beyond dispute is that the force inside Mabila vastly outnumbered the Spanish, and that the warriors were prepared and coordinated in a way that the expedition had not previously encountered. De Soto entered Mabila on October 18, 1540, with a small advance party, leaving the bulk of his army outside the walls. The first minutes were tense but controlled. Tuscaloosa was escorted inside, and De Soto's men began collecting the promised supplies. Then the trap closed. At a signal, warriors surged from the buildings inside the palisade, attacking the Spanish advance party with overwhelming force. De Soto's men, caught inside the walls with their backs to closed gates, fought desperately to break free. De Soto himself, reportedly struck multiple times but protected by his armor, cut his way to his horse and escaped through the gate. Several of his men did not. Their bodies were carried to the top of the palisade and displayed to the army outside. A calculated provocation that had exactly the intended effect. What followed was the Battle of Mabila, the bloodiest single engagement between Europeans and indigenous people in the history of North American exploration. De Soto, enraged by the ambush and the display of his men's bodies, ordered a full assault on the fortified town. The battle lasted hours. The Spanish cavalry, unable to penetrate the palisade, dismounted and fought on foot alongside the infantry, hacking at the wooden walls while arrows rained down from above. Eventually, the Spanish set fire to the structures inside the palisade, and the battle devolved into a hellscape of burning buildings, hand-to-hand combat, and suffocating smoke. The Gentleman of Elvas describes warriors fighting from inside burning houses, refusing to surrender even as the roofs collapsed around them. Women took up weapons when the warriors fell. The elderly and the children who had been sheltered inside the town burned alive. By the time the fires consumed what was left of Mabila, the destruction was total. The Spanish chroniclers claimed between 2,000 and 5,000 indigenous dead, numbers that, even if exaggerated, indicate a catastrophic loss of life. But the Spanish victory, if it could be called that, was Pyrrhic in the most literal sense. De Soto lost at least 20 soldiers killed and had nearly every surviving member of his expedition wounded, many grievously. Over 40 horses were killed, horses that could not be replaced, each one representing an irreplaceable military asset. The expedition's baggage train, left outside the walls during the initial assault, had been captured and destroyed by warriors who sortied from a secondary gate. Gone were the pearls from Cofitachequi. Gone were the expedition's supply of medicines, spare weapons, extra clothing, and much of the remaining food. Gone were the records and documents that the notaries had been keeping. Gone was the ornamental gear, the extra saddles, the personal possessions of 600 men. The army that staggered away from the smoking ruins of Mabila was a different force than the one that had landed on the beaches of Tampa Bay 17 months earlier. It was smaller, weaker, poorly supplied, traumatized, and, for the first time, genuinely unsure that its commander knew what he was doing. And then De Soto made the decision that sealed his fate, and the fate of every man who followed him. In the days after Mabila, word reached the expedition that supply ships from Cuba had arrived at a port on the Gulf Coast, perhaps 60 or 70 miles to the south. The ships carried food, weapons, reinforcements, horses, and, most importantly, a route home. De Soto's officers urged him to march south, to resupply, to evacuate the wounded, to reassess the entire enterprise in light of what Mabila had cost them. Some argued openly for abandoning the expedition entirely. They had been in the wilderness for a year and a half. They had found no gold, no silver, no empire. They had lost men and horses and supplies in a battle that had nearly destroyed them. The Gulf Coast was 2 or 3 days' march away. The ships were waiting. De Soto refused. He refused because he understood, with the particular clarity of a man whose entire identity was built on conquest, that returning to Cuba without gold would destroy him. Not physically, he would survive the voyage, but he would arrive as a failure, a man who had spent a fortune and risked hundreds of lives and found nothing. The court gossips would compare him to Narvaez, whose expedition to the same region had ended in disaster and humiliation. His creditors would demand repayment for the fortune he had spent on supplies and soldiers. His reputation foreign, the only currency that mattered in the world of the conquistadors, would be ruined. He had wagered everything on the existence of another Peru, and he could not return without finding it. So he turned his back on the ships, told no one in the army about their presence, and marched northwest into the interior of what is now Mississippi. He led his wounded, diminished, poorly supplied army away from rescue and deeper into the wilderness, chasing the same phantom he had been chasing since the day he left Spain. The ships waited at the coast. No one came. Eventually, they sailed back to Cuba with their holds still full. The men in De Soto's army would not learn about the ships until much later. When they did, the knowledge would settle into them like poison, coloring everything that followed with the bitter understanding that their commander had chosen his own ambition over their lives. The winter of 1540 into 1541 was spent in the territory of the Chickasaw, a powerful chiefdom in what is now northern Mississippi. De Soto followed the pattern that had become reflexive. He arrived at a settlement, seized the chief or compelled his cooperation through threat, demanded food and shelter for his army, and settled in for the cold months with the expectation that indigenous labor would sustain his force until spring. The Chickasaw complied at first. They provided corn from their granaries, shelter in their towns, and the outward appearance of submission. But the Chickasaw were watching. They were counting the Spanish. They were noting the wounded who could not walk, the gaps in the horse lines where animals killed at Mabila had once stood, the way the soldiers moved with a heaviness that was not just physical, but spiritual. The dragging gait of men who no longer believed in what they were doing. De Soto's demands escalated as the winter wore on. He needed porters for the spring march. He needed women. The chronicles use the word with a vagueness that barely conceals what it meant. The forced sexual servitude that was a standard feature of Spanish colonial expeditions. He needed guides who could lead the army westward toward the rumored kingdoms that still shimmered in his imagination like heat mirages over Extremaduran stone. The Chickasaw leaders listened to these demands with faces that the Spanish interpreted as compliance. What those faces actually concealed was a plan that had been forming for weeks. On a night in early March 1541, the Chickasaw attacked. They came in the hours before dawn, when the fires had burned low and the sentries were at their most vulnerable. They came with fire. Warriors crept to the edges of the Spanish encampment carrying bundles of dried cane and grass, and they lit the structures where the soldiers slept. The camp erupted. Thatched roofs caught instantly. the flames spreading from building to building faster than men could react. Soldiers stumbled from burning shelters half-naked, blinded by smoke, disoriented in the darkness. Horses tethered in makeshift corrals screamed and thrashed as the fire reached them. Some broke free and bolted into the night. Others burned where they stood. The chaos was total. The Gentleman of Elvas describes a scene of absolute pandemonium. Men running through flames, unable to find their weapons, unable to distinguish friend from enemy in the smoke and darkness. Chickasaw warriors moved through the camp with lethal purpose, killing soldiers who were still tangled in their bedding, driving lances into men who crawled on their hands and knees searching for swords they would never find. De Soto himself emerged from his quarters to find his camp in ruins around him. He mounted a horse, one of the few that had not been killed or scattered, and attempted to organize a counterattack, but the darkness and the smoke made coordinated military action impossible. The Spanish fought as individuals, each man defending the circle of firelight around him, unable to see beyond the flames. By dawn, the attack was over. The Chickasaw had withdrawn into the forests, taking their dead and wounded with them. The Spanish were left in the smoking wreckage of their camp, conducting a damage assessment that read like an obituary for the expedition's remaining capabilities. 11 Spaniards were dead, 50 horses had been killed in Binuar, a staggering loss for an army that had already lost dozens at Mabila. Nearly all of the expedition's remaining supplies had been destroyed: clothing, weapons, saddles, the forges used by the blacksmiths, the tools carried by the farriers, consumed. The army that had left Tampa Bay with the pomp and confidence of a conquering force was now, for all practical purposes, a band of refugees. Many soldiers had nothing to wear but the scorched remnants of what they had slept in. Some had no weapons at all. Rangel's account, filtered through Oviedo, captures a detail that illuminates the psychological state of the army more vividly than any summary could. In the aftermath of the fire, soldiers were seen sitting among the ashes, staring at the ground, not speaking. Officers who attempted to organize salvage parties found men who simply did not respond, who sat with their eyes open and their hands empty and their mouths closed, as if something essential inside them had been incinerated along with the camp. De Soto moved among them, shouting orders, demanding action, projecting the confidence that had always been his most powerful weapon. But confidence requires an audience that believes, and the audience was shrinking. The army's blacksmiths, men whose skills were now as critical as any soldiers, performed something close to a miracle in the days that followed. Working with salvaged materials and improvised forges, they reforged weapons from whatever metal could be recovered from the ashes. Lances were repointed. Swords were rehilted. The farriers reshod horses with iron scavenged from burned equipment. The resourcefulness was extraordinary, but it could not replace what had been lost. The expedition was now operating at a fraction of its original capability, and every subsequent engagement would further reduce its capacity to fight and survive. De Soto did not pause for long. To pause was to allow the men to think, and thought was the enemy of an enterprise that could no longer withstand rational analysis. He drove the army west, away from Chickasaw territory, away from the ashes and the dead horses and the memory of the night attack, always west, always forward. The logic, such as it was, remained unchanged. The gold must be somewhere ahead, the empire must be waiting, the next chiefdom must be the one that justified everything. In May of 1541, the army reached a site that no European had ever seen from the east, and that would become the defining geographic feature of the expedition's legacy. The Gentleman of Elvas describes the moment with an attention to scale that suggests even he, a man not given to wonder, was staggered by what lay before them. The Mississippi River. It was not like the rivers they had crossed before. Those had been obstacles, wide enough to require bridge building, deep enough to drown a horse, but ultimately finite, their far banks visible and reachable. The Mississippi was something else entirely. It was a mile wide in the place where they encountered it, somewhere in what is now the state of Mississippi or possibly Arkansas, the exact location a matter of scholarly debate. The water was brown with sediment, opaque and heavy, moving with a power that was not the rushing violence of a mountain stream but the slow, irresistible momentum of a force that could not be stopped or redirected. Entire trees floated past, not branches or debris but full-grown trees, their root system still intact, carried along like toys in a bathtub. The current created whirlpools that could swallow a boat. The far bank was a green line barely visible through the humidity, a suggestion of land rather than a certainty. The army spent weeks constructing barges to cross. The work was brutal, felling trees, shaping planks, forging the nails and fittings with their improvised tools. The indigenous people on the near bank had fled at the Spanish approach, but canoes appeared on the river, warriors observing the construction from a distance that was beyond arrow range but well within the range of curiosity. On the far bank, scouts reported large forces were gathering. The crossing would be opposed. De Soto ordered the crossing at night, hoping darkness would provide cover that strategy could not. The barges were loaded with soldiers and horses, and the fleet pushed into the current. The river fought them. Barges were swept downstream, the men aboard rowing with desperate strength against a current that treated their efforts as irrelevant. Horses panicked in the darkness, their hooves punching through the planking of barges never designed for such cargo. Some soldiers fell into the water and were carried away, the weight of their armor dragging them under before anyone could reach them. By dawn, most of the army had reached the western bank, but the crossing had scattered the force along miles of riverbank, and it took days to reassemble the column. They were now in the trans-Mississippi West. The land was different, flatter, more open, the forests giving way in places to grasslands and cane brakes that stretched to the horizon. The chiefdoms here were different too. The Mississippian societies west of the river were organized around large ceremonial centers built on earthen mounds and murids, flat-topped pyramids of packed earth that served as platforms for temples and chiefly residences. Some of these mounds were enormous, rising 40 or 50 feet above the surrounding floodplain, visible for miles across the flat landscape. The societies that built them were agricultural, dependent on the rich alluvial soils deposited by the Mississippi and its tributaries. They cultivated vast fields of corn, beans, and squash. They maintained complex social hierarchies. They traded with communities hundreds of miles away, and they had been warned by the network of runners and traders that connected the chiefdoms of the southeast that the strangers with horses and weapons and dogs were coming. The summer and fall of 1541 passed in a westward march through what is now Arkansas and possibly eastern Oklahoma or Texas. The exact route is one of the most fiercely debated questions in the archaeology and history of the 16th century Southeast. De Soto was no longer following coherent intelligence about wealthy kingdoms. He was following rumors that bent and shifted like smoke, each captured guide pointing in a different direction, each translator adding or subtracting meaning from statements that passed through 3 or 4 languages before reaching the governor's ears. The army moved through territory that was, by any honest assessment, never going to yield what De Soto sought. The land was rich, phenomenally rich in fact, with some of the most productive agricultural soil on the continent, but its wealth was measured in corn and fish and deer, not in gold and silver. The chiefdoms that controlled this land were prosperous by any reasonable standard, their granaries full, their populations healthy, their political structures stable. But prosperity measured in bushels of corn was invisible to a man who measured wealth in ingots. The chronicles from this period take on a quality of repetition that mirrors the psychological state of the army itself. The Gentleman of Elvas describes a numbing cycle. March, encounter a settlement, seize the chief, demand food and porters, receive directions to the next settlement, march again. The violence continued but had lost even the pretense of strategic purpose. Villages were burned not because their inhabitants resisted, but because their inhabitants had fled before the Spanish arrived, and De Soto interpreted flight as hostility. Captives were taken, used as porters until they collapsed, and then abandoned or killed. The war dogs continued their work. The pattern was mechanical now, driven not by military logic but by the inertia of an enterprise that had no mechanism for stopping itself. Among the soldiers, something had shifted that could not be shifted back. The Gentleman of Elvas, usually careful to maintain the narrative perspective of a loyal participant, allows glimpses of the army's deteriorating morale that are all the more powerful for their restraint. He describes soldiers who no longer spoke of gold. He describes evening camps where men sat in silence rather than gathering to share stories and plan for the wealth they would bring home. He describes the particular quality of obedience that replaces belief. Men who followed orders not because they trusted their commander's vision, but because following orders was the only structure that remained in a world that had ceased to make sense. The army had become a machine that marched because marching was what it did, led by a man who searched because searching was all he knew how to do. De Soto's own psychological state during this period is largely inaccessible. The chronicles describe his actions but rarely his inner life, and the actions themselves are ambiguous. He maintained discipline. He continued to interrogate captives about gold and wealthy kingdoms. He continued to punish resistance with the same calculated brutality he had employed from the beginning. But there are hints, scattered through the accounts like cracks in a wall, that suggest the certainty that had driven him since Peru was eroding. Rangel describes a governor who had become prone to sudden bursts of anger at his officers, eruptions of temper that were disproportionate to their causes, and that left the men around him wary and watchful. The Gentleman of Elvas notes that De Soto had begun making decisions that reversed themselves within days, ordering the army in one direction, then countermanding the order and turning in another, as if the compass inside him that had always pointed toward gold was now spinning without purchase. He was lost. Not in the geographical sense, though the army's position relative to any known European settlement was a source of constant anxiety. He was lost in the deeper sense, a man whose entire identity had been constructed around the certainty that he would find an empire confronting the growing possibility that no empire existed. Every day that the army marched without finding gold was a day that the foundation of his selfhood eroded a little further. The gold from Peru, the memory of the ransom room at Cajamarca, the image of Atahualpa on his golden litter, these memories, which had sustained his ambition and justified his brutality for nearly a decade, were becoming not inspirations but torments. They were the proof of what was possible, and they made the reality of what was actually happening. The endless forests, the corn-filled granaries, the absence of any treasure his men could carry home, unbearable. The army turned south and east as winter approached in late 1541, circling back toward the Mississippi River Valley. De Soto established a winter camp in the territory of a chiefdom called Utiangue, somewhere in central Arkansas. The winter was harsh, colder than the subtropical winters of Florida, with freezing rains and occasional snow that the Spanish, many of whom lacked adequate clothing after the Chickasaw fire, endured in misery. Food was scarce. The army had consumed or destroyed the surplus of every chiefdom it had passed through, and the territory around the winter camp had been stripped of resources by the army's own foraging parties within weeks. Soldiers ate their horses when the animals died. They ate the dogs, not the war mastiffs, which were too valuable, but the smaller animals that had accumulated around the camp. They ate whatever the surrounding forest offered, supplemented by corn taken at sword point from indigenous communities that could not afford to lose it. The winter at Utiangue was the expedition's valley of shadow. The Gentleman of Elvas describes an army that had crossed from hardship into genuine desperation. Diseases that had been manageable in warmer months, fevers, dysentery, infections from untreated wounds, became lethal in the cold. Men died quietly, their passing noted in the chronicles with the flat numerical brevity of an accounting ledger. The expedition's priests heard confessions and administered last rites with a frequency that turned sacred ritual into grim routine. The dead were buried without ceremony, the graves shallow because the ground was frozen, and the living lacked the strength for deep excavation. De Soto spent the winter making plans that had the quality of fever dreams. He spoke of marching west to find the Pacific Ocean, which he believed could not be far. He spoke of finding a route to China. He spoke of discovering silver mines that the indigenous people had mentioned, or that his translators had reported they mentioned, the distinction being impossible to verify and, to De Soto, irrelevant. He pored over information extracted from captives, building mental maps of a landscape that existed partly in reality and partly in his own desperate imagination. Each rumor of distant wealth given the same weight as a confirmed geographic feature. His officers listened and said little. The dynamics within the command structure had shifted in ways that the chronicles only partially reveal. De Soto still commanded absolute authority. His title as governor and adelantado was a legal instrument backed by the Spanish crown, and open defiance would have been treason. But authority without credibility is a fragile thing, and De Soto's credibility had been draining away since the moment he turned his back on the supply ships at the Gulf Coast. His officers obeyed, but their obedience had the mechanical quality of men fulfilling a contract they could not legally break. When De Soto outlined his plans for the spring campaign, they nodded and made their preparations. But the conversations in the officers' quarters after De Soto retired, conversations the chronicles do not record but that every military organization in every era has conducted, must have been dark and direct. The governor was leading them to their deaths. The gold did not exist, and the distance between their current position and any hope of rescue was growing with every step they took. Spring came to the Mississippi Valley in 1542, and with it a renewal of movement that the Army's physical state could barely support. De Soto led the column south, back toward the Mississippi River, driven by yet another iteration of the persistent rumor. This time, that wealthy communities lay downstream along the great river's lower course. The army that moved through the warming forests of Arkansas and into what is now Louisiana was a ghost of the force that had landed at Tampa Bay. Of the original 600 soldiers, roughly 350 remained alive. Of the 200 horses, fewer than 40 had survived the accumulated losses of combat, disease, starvation, and the Chickasaw fire. The war dogs were gone or reduced to a handful. The blacksmith forges, rebuilt after each disaster, produced cruder work with each iteration as materials dwindled and the smiths themselves grew weak. The column no longer moved with the disciplined order of a military formation. It straggled through the landscape in loose clusters, the distances between groups widening as the strongest pushed ahead and the weakest fell behind. The indigenous societies of the lower Mississippi Valley were among the most complex the expedition had encountered. Large chiefdoms controlling extensive territories along the river, their population sustained by the extraordinary fertility of the alluvial floodplain. These were the builders of the great mounds, the engineers of elaborate earthworks, the practitioners of a political and spiritual sophistication that the Spanish were incapable of recognizing because it did not express itself in the materials they valued. The chiefs of the lower Mississippi controlled surplus food production that would have been the envy of many European communities. They maintained trade networks that moved goods across hundreds of miles. They governed populations that, in some cases, numbered in the tens of thousands. They also knew the Spanish were coming. The communication networks of the Mississippian world, runners, traders, refugees from the devastation De Soto had left in his wake, had carried word of the expedition's methods far ahead of its actual arrival. The chiefs of the lower Mississippi had months to prepare, and they used the time well. Some chose accommodation, calculating that cooperation would spare their people the worst of the Spanish violence. Others prepared for war, and others simply moved, relocating their populations away from the river and the route the Spanish were expected to follow, emptying towns and burning their own granaries rather than allowing the invaders to feed on their stores. It was into this landscape of forewarned and variously prepared chiefdoms that De Soto marched in the spring of 1542, and it was here on the western bank of the Mississippi River, in a territory whose chief the Spanish called Guachoya, that the expedition entered its final act. De Soto arrived at Guachoya in April 1542. he was visibly diminished. The chronicles describe a man whose physical deterioration had become impossible to ignore. He had lost weight. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he moved with a stiffness that suggested either injury or illness or both. The energy that had driven him through 3 years of wilderness, that had propelled him out of burning camps and across mile-wide rivers, was failing. His officers could see it. His soldiers could see it. The indigenous leaders who met with him could see it, and they measured the implications with the cold precision of people whose survival depended on accurately assessing the strength of the dangerous strangers in their midst. De Soto attempted to project power in the way he always had. He seized the chief of Guachoya. He demanded food, porters, canoes. He sent messengers downstream to the chief of a rival polity called Quiqualtem, demanding submission and tribute. The response he received from Quiqualtem's chief was by all accounts remarkable in its defiance. The chief sent word that he was accustomed to visiting no one, that others visited him. That if the Spanish commander wished to see him, he should come to Quiqualtem. That if De Soto came in peace, he would be received in peace. That if De Soto came in war, the chief would await him in his town, and neither he nor his people would retreat one step. It was the response of a leader who understood that the man issuing demands was weakening, that the army behind the demands was breaking. That time in the river and the wilderness were doing the work that arrows and fire had only partially accomplished. De Soto heard the message and raged. He ordered preparations for an assault on Quiqualtem, demanding that his officers organize a river-borne attack on the defiant chief's territory. But his body had already begun the process of betrayal that his will could not overrule. Within days of receiving Quiqualtem's response, De Soto fell ill with a fever that the chronicles describe but cannot diagnose. It may have been malaria or typhoid, or any of the dozens of tropical and waterborne diseases that the army had been exposed to for 3 years. The fever climbed and did not break. De Soto took to his bed, the bed of animal skins in the crude shelter on the banks of the Mississippi, and his officers gathered around him with the particular attentiveness of men who were simultaneously watching their commander die and calculating what his death would mean for their own survival. He was lucid enough in his final days to understand what was happening. He named Luis de Moscoso Alvarado as his successor, a choice that reflected either genuine confidence in Moscoso's ability or, more likely, the absence of any better option. He spoke with his officers about the expedition's future, about the need to find a route to Mexico or back to the Gulf Coast. He did not speak about gold. The chronicles record no final words about the treasure that had drawn him across an ocean and a continent. Whether this silence represented acceptance, despair, or simply the inability of a dying body to sustain the fictions that had sustained a life, the accounts do not say. Hernando de Soto died on May 21, 1542. He was approximately 42 years old. He had been in the wilderness of North America for 3 years. He had marched his army across a distance that modern scholars estimate at roughly 4,000 miles. He had encountered dozens of indigenous societies. He had fought in multiple battles. He had crossed the largest river on the continent. He had found nothing that he was looking for. The problem of his body presented itself immediately and with terrible urgency. The Spanish had told the indigenous people of Guachoya and of every other chiefdom they had passed through that their commander was a child of the sun, immortal, a being of divine origin who could not be killed by mortal means. The claim was not casual mythology. It was a deliberate tactical construction, a psychological weapon deployed with the same calculated intent as the war dogs and the mutilations. If the native peoples believed that the Spanish leader could not die, they would be less likely to attempt killing him and less likely to resist an army led by an apparently supernatural being. The lie had served De Soto well for 3 years. Now it threatened to destroy everything that remained of his expedition. If the chiefs of Guachoya and the surrounding territories discovered that De Soto was dead, that the child of the sun was mortal after all, that the invincible commander was a corpse rotting in the Mississippi heat. The 300 surviving Spaniards would be exposed as what they had always been, a diminished, exhausted, poorly supplied band of men 1,000 miles from the nearest European settlement, surrounded by indigenous populations that vastly outnumbered them and that had every reason in the world to want them dead. The thin membrane of supernatural terror that had kept those populations from coordinating a devastating attack would rupture, and what poured through would be fatal. Moscoso and the surviving officers understood this with the visceral clarity of men whose lives depended on the next decision being correct. They had to dispose of the body in a way that prevented the indigenous people from discovering the truth, and they had to do it quickly. The Mississippi heat would begin its work within hours, and a decomposing body would announce its presence to anyone within a considerable distance. Their first attempt was burial. Under cover of darkness, working with the desperate efficiency of men concealing a murder rather than honoring a commander, they dug a grave within the walls of the camp and buried De Soto's body. But the ground near the river was soft and shallow to the water table, and the grave could not be made deep enough to prevent discovery. More critically, the indigenous people of Guachoya had been watching the Spanish camp with an attentiveness that the soldiers could feel but not always see. The Gentleman of Elvas records that within a day of the burial, indigenous visitors to the camp were observed looking at the freshly turned earth with an interest that was impossible to misinterpret. They knew something had been buried. They were asking questions through the translators about where the governor had gone. The answers the Spanish provided, that De Soto had ascended to the sky to commune with the sun, that he would return shortly, that his absence was temporary and voluntary, were met with a politeness that did not quite conceal skepticism. The officers convened again, and the decision was made. They would disinter the body, take it to the center of the Mississippi River, and sink it where no one would ever find it. The river that De Soto had crossed as a conqueror would receive him as a secret, and the secret would keep the army alive long enough to find a way home. They worked at night. The body was wrapped tightly in blankets and weighted with sand. Some accounts say stones, but the alluvial riverbank would have offered sand more readily, and the bundle was carried to a canoe beached at the water's edge. A small party of officers paddled the canoe to the center of the river, to the point where the current ran deepest, and the brown water was opaque enough to swallow anything committed to it. They slid the bundle over the side. It sank immediately. The current carried whatever trace remained downstream toward the Gulf that De Soto had sought as a highway to further conquest, and that now served only as the direction of his dissolution. The men paddled back to shore. The grave inside the camp was filled and obscured. When indigenous visitors asked about the governor, they were told he had traveled downstream on a mission and would return. The lie held. For how long, the chronicles do not precisely say, but it held long enough for Moscoso to consolidate his authority and begin the desperate work of getting the surviving expedition out of the wilderness and back to the Spanish world. Moscoso inherited a command that no rational person would have wanted. 311 Spaniards remained alive, along with an unknown number of enslaved indigenous people who had been forced to accompany the expedition as porters and servants. Fewer than 40 horses had survived. The army's weapons were a patchwork of original equipment, battlefield salvage, and improvised replacements forged from scavenged metal. Food supplies were whatever could be seized from the surrounding territory, a resource that was finite and defended. The army had no ships, no boats capable of ocean travel, no maps of the territory between their current position and the nearest Spanish settlements in Mexico, and no reliable way to communicate with the outside world. They were, in the most literal sense, stranded. Moscoso's first decision was to attempt an overland march to Mexico. The reasoning was straightforward. Mexico was a known destination, a functioning colony with ports and ships and the infrastructure of civilization. If the army could march west and south far enough, it would eventually reach Spanish settlements. The distance was unknown but was assumed to be manageable. The assumption was wrong. The army turned west in June 1542, pushing into the territories beyond the Mississippi River. lands that are now western Louisiana, eastern Texas, and possibly the fringes of Oklahoma. The terrain changed dramatically. The rich river valleys and dense forests of the Mississippi Basin gave way to drier, more open country. Grasslands and prairies interspersed with scrubby woods and crossed by rivers that ran lower and slower than the Great Eastern waterways. The indigenous societies of this region were different too, smaller, more mobile, less tied to the fixed agricultural settlements that had characterized the chiefdoms of the Southeast. Some were semi-nomadic, following seasonal patterns of hunting and gathering that kept them moving across territories too large for a weakened Spanish army to control or even comprehend. The march west was an exercise in diminishing returns. Each day took the army farther from the Mississippi and its network of food-producing chiefdoms and deeper into territory where surplus food was scarcer and the people who possessed it were harder to find and harder to coerce. The landscape offered no landmarks that corresponded to anything in the Spanish geographical imagination. There were no mountain ranges to orient by, no coastlines to follow, no rivers flowing in directions that suggested proximity to known territories. The army was navigating by rumor and intuition, guided by captured indigenous people whose languages the remaining translators could barely comprehend and whose motivations for pointing in any particular direction were entirely opaque. The Gentleman of Elvas describes weeks of marching that produced nothing, no wealthy settlements, no recognizable geography, no indication that Mexico was getting closer. The land became drier. Water sources grew unreliable. The indigenous communities they encountered were smaller and poorer, their resources insufficient to sustain an army of 300 even through extortion. Soldiers began dying again, not from combat, which had grown infrequent as the army moved into territories where the populations were too sparse to mount significant resistance, but from the accumulated toll of malnutrition, untreated illness, and the particular exhaustion that comes from marching without purpose through a landscape without end. After several months of westward travel, the exact duration and distance are subjects of scholarly dispute, Moscoso made the decision to turn back. The army had not found Mexico. It had not found a route to Mexico. It had found only more wilderness, stretching toward a horizon that never resolved into anything familiar. The provisions seized from indigenous communities along the route had been consumed, and the territory behind them had been stripped bare by their own passage, meaning the return march would be through land that could no longer feed them. The decision to retreat was an acknowledgement of what De Soto had never been willing to acknowledge. The continent was larger than European ambition, and it would not yield to men on foot. The army staggered back to the Mississippi River, arriving in December 1542. 7 months after De Soto's death. They were fewer than when they had departed. The exact losses during the westward march are not recorded with precision, but the chronicles make clear that men and horses continued to die at a rate that made the army's long-term survival doubtful. The soldiers who reached the river were gaunt, many of them dressed in animal skins because their clothing had disintegrated months earlier. They looked, the Gentleman of Elvas observed with a rare flash of self-awareness, less like a European army than like the people they had been brutalizing for 3.5 years. Moscoso established a winter camp near the junction of the Mississippi with one of its major tributaries. The exact location is uncertain, but somewhere in what is now Louisiana, and set his men to the task that would determine whether any of them survived to see Spain again. They would build boats. Not the crude barges they had constructed to cross the Mississippi 1.5 years earlier, but actual vessels, brigantines capable of carrying men, horses, and supplies down the Mississippi and along the Gulf Coast to the Spanish settlement at Panuco in northeastern Mexico. The decision to build boats rather than attempt another overland march represented a fundamental shift in the expedition's psychology. For 3.5 years, the army had defined itself as a land force. Cavalry and infantry, horses and war dogs, a mobile military machine designed to march and fight and seize. Building boats meant abandoning that identity. It meant killing the remaining horses for their hides and meat, since the animals could not be carried aboard the vessels. It meant melting down weapons and armor for nails and fittings. It meant transforming from conquerors into refugees, from an army into a flotilla of desperate men hoping the current would carry them to safety. The construction took months. The army had no ship rights. None had been included in the original expedition because De Soto had never planned to need them. What they had were soldiers with some experience of woodworking, blacksmiths who could forge nails if they had iron to forge them from, and the collective resourcefulness of men who understood that the alternative to building functional boats was dying on the banks of the Mississippi. They felled trees and shaped planks with axes and adzes. They caulked the seams with a mixture of pine resin and fiber, a technique some of the men had observed in indigenous boat building. They forged nails from every piece of metal they could find: stirrups, buckles, broken swords, the iron fittings of saddles that would never again be mounted on horses that were being slaughtered for food and raw materials. The horses were killed systematically. Each animal was butchered, its meat dried and stored as provisions for the river journey, its hide tanned and used for water containers or protective coverings for the boats. For men who had spent their adult lives on horseback, who had defined their identity and their military superiority through their relationship with their mounts, the killing of the horses was a psychological severance that the chronicles note but do not dwell on. The Gentleman of Elvas records the process with his customary detachment, listing the number of animals slaughtered and the uses to which their bodies were put. But somewhere behind those flat sentences is the unrecorded grief of cavalrymen watching the dismantling of everything they were. The indigenous people of the surrounding territory watched the construction with an interest that the Spanish found unnerving. The army's pretense that De Soto was alive and temporarily absent had grown thin over the months since his death, and the spectacle of the Spanish building boats, clearly preparing to leave Nard for Hawam, made the fiction untenable. If the strangers were leaving, something had changed. If something had changed, the supernatural commander was perhaps not supernatural after all. The chronicles describe increasing tension between the Spanish camp and the surrounding chiefdoms during the winter of 1542 to 1543, a slow escalation of probing attacks, stolen tools, and killed sentries that made the boat building a race against the deterioration of the army's security. The work produced 7 brigantines, crude vessels by European standards, flat-bottomed and shallow-drafted, each capable of carrying approximately 40 to 50 men along with provisions and the few remaining weapons. They were not seaworthy in any meaningful sense. They were river craft, designed to float downstream and, with luck, to survive the relatively sheltered coastal waters of the Gulf. In open ocean, they would have been death traps. But open ocean was a problem for later. The immediate problem was getting 300 men and their supplies onto the Mississippi and moving south before the surrounding chiefdoms decided that the moment to attack had arrived. The flotilla launched in early July 1543, more than 4 years after the expedition had first landed on the beaches of Tampa Bay. 311 Spaniards and an unknown number of enslaved indigenous captives pushed off from the western bank of the Mississippi and committed themselves to the current. Behind them, they left the remains of the winter camp, the graves of their companions, the bones of their horses, and the wreckage of an enterprise that had consumed a fortune, destroyed dozens of indigenous communities, and produced nothing that could be measured in the ledgers of the Spanish crown. The journey down the Mississippi was 17 days of sustained terror. The river, which from the bank had seemed to move with ponderous slowness, revealed a power from its surface that the men in the brigantines could feel through the hulls of their vessels. The current was relentless, carrying the boats south at a speed that made them difficult to steer and impossible to stop. Submerged logs, entire trees hidden just beneath the opaque surface, struck the hulls with impacts that cracked planking and opened seams, sending men scrambling with buckets and caulking material to prevent boats from swamping. The river narrowed in places, compressing the current into channels where the water moved with a velocity that spun the brigantines like leaves. In other places, it widened into bewildering expanses where the banks disappeared and the fleet found itself in a brown, featureless waterscape with no way to determine direction except by the current's pull, and the indigenous people of the lower Mississippi pursued them. The chiefdoms of the lower river had been preparing for this moment. Word had traveled ahead of the flotilla. The network of communication that had preceded the Spanish throughout their entire expedition now served to coordinate their departure. War canoes appeared on the river behind and alongside the brigantines, large craft carrying dozens of warriors armed with bows. The canoes were faster than the brigantines, more maneuverable, and operated by men who understood the river's currents with an intimacy that the Spanish could not match. They attacked in waves, loosing arrows at the boats from distances that made retaliation with Spanish crossbows and arquebuses difficult. The flat-bottom brigantines, designed for cargo capacity rather than speed, could not outrun the canoes. The Spanish could not fight effectively from vessels that rocked with every wave and that required constant attention to steering and bailing. The arrows came in flights, dozens at a time, arcing from the canoes in coordinated volleys that struck the water. The hulls. The men crouched behind whatever cover they could improvise from shields and planking. The Gentleman of Elvas describes days when the pursuit was continuous. Canoes appearing at dawn and following the fleet until darkness made archery impractical, then reappearing the next morning with fresh warriors replacing those who had fought the day before. The Spanish had no such luxury of rotation. The same men who fought off attacks during the day spent the night bailing water, repairing damage, and trying to sleep in vessels too crowded and too wet for real rest. Soldiers were killed by arrows, others were wounded, and in the absence of medical supplies endured infections that would kill them slowly over the following days. The dead were rolled over the side into the river, joining their commander in the brown current that carried everything south. The fleet passed through the territories of multiple chiefdoms during the descent, and each chiefdom presented its own threat. Some pursued, others blocked the river with formations of canoes, forcing the brigantines to run a gauntlet of arrow fire. Others watched from the banks without attacking, their restraint more unnerving in some ways than open hostility, because the Spanish could not know whether the next bend in the river would reveal a peaceful shore or a wall of war canoes. One chiefdom, described in the chronicles as the most powerful on the lower river, mounted an attack of such scale that the Gentleman of Elvas devotes considerable attention to it. Hundreds of canoes, according to his account, descended on the fleet from both banks simultaneously, the warriors singing and drumming as they closed the distance. The sound carried across the water, a rhythmic, coordinated war chant that was intended to terrify and succeeded. The Spanish fired their remaining crossbow bolts and the few arquebus rounds they had left, but the ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the canoes were too numerous for individual marksmanship to affect the outcome. The fleet survived by staying in the center of the current, where the river's speed gave them just enough advantage over the canoes to maintain distance, and by the fact that the pursuing warriors eventually reached the boundary of their territory and fell back, replaced by the canoes of the next chiefdom downstream. The pattern repeated for 17 days of arrows and water and fear, and the endless brown expanse of the continent's greatest river carrying them toward an uncertain destination. Men died each day. The boats took damage that the crude repairs could only partially address. The provisions, dried horse meat, seized corn, whatever could be eaten without cooking, diminished with each mile. The soldiers grew weaker. The wounded grew sicker. The dead grew more numerous. And then the river ended. The Mississippi Delta opened before the fleet like a wound in the earth, or a vast labyrinthine expanse of marsh, mudflat, and shifting channels where the river dissolved into the Gulf of Mexico. The transition from river to sea was not a clean line, but a gradual disintegration, the current losing its coherence as it spread across miles of shallow, brackish water. The brigantines, designed for river travel, now had to navigate a coastal environment for which they were profoundly unsuited. The Gulf of Mexico, even along its sheltered northern shore, produced swells and currents that the flat-bottom boats rode with a sickening instability. Water came over the gunwales. Men who had learned to bail on the river now bailed with the knowledge that sinking in the Gulf meant drowning beyond reach of any shore. The fleet turned west along the coast, hugging the shoreline as closely as the shallow drafts of the brigantines would allow. The journey from the mouth of the Mississippi to the Spanish settlement at Panuco was approximately 500 miles of coastline, a distance that would take weeks to cover in vessels that could barely survive open water. The coast offered no ports, no friendly settlements, no reliable sources of food or fresh water. The men went ashore when they could, foraging on beaches and in coastal marshes for whatever the land offered: shellfish, birds, the eggs of nesting seabirds, brackish water that they drank because the alternative was dehydration. The coastline crept past with agonizing slowness. The brigantines, battered by weeks on the river and inadequately constructed from the beginning, leaked continuously. The caulking failed in the salt water. Seams that had held on the freshwater river opened in the Gulf swells, and the men bailed around the clock, sleeping in shifts while the boats slowly filled and were slowly emptied and slowly filled again. The sun on the Gulf was brutal, reflected off the water. It burned exposed skin until it blistered and cracked, and the salt water that washed over the gunnels turned every open wound into an agony of infection. Men continued to die. Some from wounds taken on the river, some from illness, some from the accumulated physical destruction of 4 years of malnutrition, exposure, and violence. Their bodies went into the Gulf, as their commander's body had gone into the river, unmarked, unrecovered, carried by currents that did not care what empires they had sought or what cruelties they had committed in the seeking. The fleet reached the Panuco River and the Spanish settlement there in September 1543, 53 days after launching from the banks of the Mississippi. 311 men had entered the boats. Somewhere around 300 survived to reach Panuco. The exact number varies between the chronicles, and the difference between the accounts represents men who died on the water and whose deaths were recorded by some witnesses and not others. They arrived barefoot, many of them nearly naked, their skin burned and scarred and covered with insect bites and the marks of healed and unhealed wounds. They were emaciated. They were bearded and long-haired and filthy. They looked to the Spanish colonists who watched them stumble ashore at Panuco like men who had been to a place that should not exist and had come back as evidence of what that place did to human beings. The colonists at Panuco received them with a mixture of compassion and horror. Food was provided, clothing was provided, medical attention, such as it was in a 16th century colonial settlement, was provided. The survivors ate and slept and ate again, their bodies beginning the slow process of rebuilding from the cellular level outward, but the psychological damage was not amenable to food and rest. The Gentleman of Elvas, writing his account sometime after returning to Portugal, describes the survivors as men who had difficulty readjusting to the rhythms of settled life, men who startled at unexpected sounds, who ate as if food might be taken from them at any moment, who sat in silence during conversations and stared at distances that had nothing to do with the physical space around them. He does not use the language of trauma because the language did not exist, but what he describes is unmistakable across the centuries. Moscoso attempted to compile a report for the colonial authorities, an accounting of the expedition's route, its discoveries, its losses, and its costs. The exercise was, in its way, as brutal as anything the wilderness had inflicted. To set down in writing the 4 years of marching, fighting, seizing, burning, mutilating, and dying, and to arrive at the bottom line, no gold found, no settlements established, no trade routes opened, no territories secured, the expedition's commander dead and buried in a river, was to confront the magnitude of the failure in terms that could not be argued with or reinterpreted. The expedition had cost De Soto his entire fortune and his life. It had cost Spain several hundred soldiers and the resources to equip and transport them. It had cost the indigenous peoples of the Southeast something that would not be fully understood for centuries. The survivors scattered. Some remained in Mexico, taking up positions in the colonial administration. or attaching themselves to other enterprises. Some returned to Spain, where they found that the world had moved on without them, that the 4 years they had spent in the wilderness had passed in the metropole as a rumor, a brief item of court gossip, a question occasionally asked and quickly forgotten. A few, including the Gentleman of Elvas, eventually wrote their accounts of the expedition, preserving for posterity a record that would otherwise have disappeared into the same silence that swallowed De Soto's body. The expedition's legacy began its long, complex, and deeply troubling unfolding in the years and decades that followed the survivors' return. What De Soto left behind in the southeast was not the empire he had sought, but something far more consequential and far more destructive. The diseases came first, and they came with a thoroughness that no army could have achieved. De Soto's expedition had carried pathogens into the interior of North America with the same inevitability that it carried swords and horses: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. Diseases that had circulated in European and Asian populations for centuries, against which those populations had developed at least partial immunity, and against which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no defense whatsoever. The biological mechanism was simple and merciless. European diseases required human hosts. The expedition provided a mobile reservoir of infection: 600 men, 200 horses, herds of pigs, and the enslaved indigenous people forced to march with the column that moved through territory after territory, community after community, leaving behind not just burned villages and mutilated bodies, but invisible contagions that would continue their work long after the last Spaniard had passed. The pigs may have been the most devastating weapon in De Soto's arsenal, and he never knew it. The herd of several hundred swine driven alongside the column served its intended purpose as a self-replenishing food supply, but it also served as an extraordinarily efficient disease vector. Pigs carry and transmit a range of pathogens that can jump to human populations, influenza strains in particular, but also parasites and bacterial infections that thrive in the interface between domesticated animals and human communities. The pigs roamed freely, foraging in the forests and fields around each camp, contaminating water sources and food supplies. When indigenous communities seized or received pigs as gifts or tribute, they acquired not just protein, but a biological time bomb. The animals bred prolifically. They escaped into the wild. They spread across territories the army never entered, carrying their invisible cargo into populations that had no way of understanding what was killing them. The epidemics that followed De Soto's expedition are among the most catastrophic demographic events in human history, and they are also among the most poorly documented for the simple and terrible reason that the people who died left no written records, and the people who might have observed the dying had already departed. What we know comes from archaeology and from the accounts of later European visitors who arrived in territories that De Soto's chroniclers had described as densely populated and found them empty. The evidence is stark. Archaeological sites throughout the southeastern United States show a pattern of abandonment and population collapse that begins in the mid-16th century, precisely the period following De Soto's expedition. Large Mississippian centers that had been continuously occupied for centuries were abandoned within a generation of the expedition's passage. Mound complexes that had served as the political and ceremonial hearts of powerful chiefdoms fell into disuse, their earthworks eroding, their plazas overgrown, the elaborate social structures they had supported dissolving as the populations that maintained them were decimated. The great chiefdoms that De Soto had encountered, Cofitachequi, Coosa, Tuscaloosa's domain, the polities of the lower Mississippi, were shadows of themselves within decades, and many had ceased to exist entirely by the time the next wave of European explorers arrived in the 17th century. The scale of the population collapse is difficult to comprehend and remains a subject of intense scholarly debate. Conservative estimates suggest that indigenous populations in the areas traversed by De Soto declined by 50 to 75% within a century of the expedition. Some scholars argue that the decline was even more severe, that in certain regions 90% or more of the pre-contact population was lost to disease, warfare, enslavement, and the social disintegration that accompanied demographic catastrophe. The numbers are abstract at this scale. They resist emotional comprehension. 50% of a population, 75%, 90%. These are statistics, and statistics are the language of distance. What they represent is something closer to the end of worlds. Consider what it means for a chiefdom of 10,000 people to lose 75% of its population within a generation. The dead are not distributed randomly. Disease kills the very young and the very old disproportionately, but it also kills the adults in their prime, the farmers, the warriors, the mothers, the craftspeople, the priests, the chiefs, the storytellers, the keepers of knowledge. When a chief dies, his successor may already be dead, and the successor's successor. The political structure that organized collective life, that determined who planted which fields, who stored grain for winter, who maintained the mound complexes and conducted the ceremonies that bound the community together, collapses not from conquest but from the absence of the people who operated it. The knowledge stored in human memory, agricultural techniques refined over centuries, trade relationships maintained across generations, the oral histories that gave a people their identity and their continuity, dies with the people who carried it. A community that loses 3/4 of its population does not simply become smaller. It becomes something fundamentally different, a remnant struggling to maintain coherence with resources and knowledge systems designed for a population 4 times its size. The mound centers were abandoned not because the survivors chose to leave, but because the communities that had built and maintained them could no longer function at the scale those centers required. A mound complex was not just an architectural achievement, it was the physical expression of a political and spiritual order that demanded a certain minimum population to sustain. The laborers who maintained the earthworks, the farmers who produced the surplus that supported the priests and chiefs who lived atop the mounds, the warriors who defended the territory, the traders who maintained the networks of exchange. When disease removed enough of these people, the system did not gradually shrink, it collapsed. The way a bridge collapses when enough supports are removed. Not incrementally, but catastrophically. The remaining structure unable to bear the load that the missing pieces had carried. The survivors reorganized. They formed new communities, new political structures, new identities built from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. The Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Siksika, the great southeastern nations that Europeans would encounter in the 17th and 18th centuries were in many cases coalescent societies, formed from the merger of remnant populations that had survived the demographic catastrophe of the 16th century. These were not the same societies that De Soto had encountered. They were what grew in the devastation his expedition left behind. New formations that carried within them fragments of the older world, but that were fundamentally shaped by the experience of loss on a scale that defies historical parallel in most of human experience. When English and French explorers entered the southeast in the late 17th century, they found a landscape that seemed to confirm European assumptions about indigenous primitiveness. The great mound centers were overgrown ruins. The dense populations described in the Spanish chronicles had vanished, replaced by smaller, more dispersed communities that struck European observers as evidence that the land had always been sparsely populated. The explorers did not understand, could not have understood, given the limitations of their knowledge, that they were looking at the aftermath of an apocalypse. The empty forests and abandoned earthworks were not evidence of indigenous simplicity. They were evidence of indigenous catastrophe, a catastrophe that European diseases had inflicted and that European ignorance now interpreted as a natural condition. This misunderstanding had consequences that compounded across centuries. The perception that the southeastern interior was lightly populated and underutilized became a justification for European colonization. Why should such fertile land go to waste when civilized nations could put it to productive use? The elaborate Mississippian societies that De Soto had encountered, with their mound complexes and surplus agriculture and complex political hierarchies, were erased from European memory. What replaced them was a narrative of emptiness, of wilderness waiting to be tamed, of land that belonged to no one because the people who had belonged to it were dead, and the people who descended from the survivors were not recognized as heirs to what had been destroyed. De Soto's expedition had another legacy, more immediate and more directly traceable in the documentary record. It effectively ended Spanish interest in the interior of North America for decades. The expedition's failure was comprehensive. No gold, no silver, no passage to China, no settled territory, no surviving commander, and a bill of expenses that represented a total loss for the crown. The reports that filtered back to Spain through the survivors' accounts painted a picture of a vast, hostile, unprofitable wilderness inhabited by people who could not be subdued by the methods that had worked in Mexico and Peru. The cost-benefit calculation was devastating. Why spend treasure and lives exploring a continent that offered nothing the empire valued, when the silver mines of Mexico and the wealth of Peru continued to produce returns that justified their conquest? Spain turned its attention elsewhere. The interior of the continent below the Great Lakes would not see another major European expedition for over a century. When the French eventually penetrated the Mississippi Valley in the 1670s and 1680s, they entered a landscape that had been fundamentally transformed by the century and a half of disease, displacement, and reorganization that followed De Soto's passage. The world they found bore little resemblance to the world De Soto had found, and neither they nor anyone else at the time understood why. The moral dimensions of De Soto's expedition resist the comforting simplifications that historical distance sometimes permits. He was not uniquely evil. The methods he employed, the seizure of chiefs, the enslavement of captives, the use of terror as a tool of control, the mutilation of resistors, the deployment of war dogs against human beings were standard operating procedures in the Spanish colonial enterprise. Other conquistadors used the same methods, often with greater scale and equal brutality. Pedrarias, De Soto's first patron, was responsible for atrocities in Central America that rivaled anything De Soto committed in the southeast. Pizarro's conquest of Peru involved massacres that exceeded Mabila in sheer numbers of dead. The encomienda system that governed Spanish colonial labor relations was, in its structural logic, a mechanism for the extraction of human life in exchange for legal fictions about Christian salvation and civilizational uplift. De Soto operated within a system. He did not create the system. He was its product, shaped by its incentives, rewarded for its methods, and ultimately destroyed by its logic. But the fact that he operated within a system does not dissolve his individual responsibility any more than the existence of an army dissolves the responsibility of the soldier who pulls the trigger. De Soto made choices. He chose to march into the interior when he could have established a coastal settlement. He chose to seize chiefs when he could have attempted diplomacy. He chose to mutilate captives when he could have released them. He chose to turn his back on the supply ships after Mabila when he could have evacuated his wounded and reassessed his enterprise. He chose to continue marching west when every piece of evidence told him that the gold did not exist. Each of these choices was made by a specific man in a specific moment, and each choice had consequences that radiated outward through indigenous communities like the shock waves of a detonation. The system enabled him. His choices defined him. The indigenous perspective on these events is necessarily the most difficult to recover and the most important to acknowledge. The 4 Spanish chronicles that form the primary record of the expedition are, by their nature, accounts written by participants in and beneficiaries of the invasion. They describe indigenous people through the lens of European categories and European interests. Chiefs are assessed for their willingness to cooperate. Warriors are assessed for their military capability. Women are noted when they are objects of seizure or when their behavior is remarkable enough to overcome the chronicler's general indifference to indigenous humanity. The inner lives of the people who experienced De Soto's passage, the terror, the grief, the rage, the confusion of encountering a force that operated by rules no prior experience could have prepared them for, are almost entirely absent from the written record. What we can recover comes from archaeology and from the oral traditions of descendant communities, sources that are fragmentary but that carry a weight the Spanish chronicles cannot match. The archaeological record shows communities that adapted, resisted, and survived, people who modified their settlement patterns, their political structures, and their subsistence strategies in response to the catastrophe that the Spanish inflicted and the diseases that followed. The oral traditions of southeastern nations preserve memories of contact and conflict that, while transformed by centuries of transmission, retain emotional truths about the experience of invasion that no Spanish account captures. These traditions speak of strangers who came from the water, who rode animals never before seen, who carried weapons of impossible power, and who brought death in forms both visible and invisible. They speak of resistance and of loss. They speak of worlds that ended and worlds that began in the aftermath. The Lady of Cofitachequi remains one of the most haunting figures in the narrative, a leader of diplomatic sophistication and personal dignity who offered friendship to strangers and received captivity in return. Her escape into the forests carrying the box of pearls that De Soto had claimed for himself is one of the few moments in the chronicles where an indigenous person exercises agency that the Spanish cannot control or contain. She vanishes from the record after that escape, returning to a life that the chronicles have no interest in following. But her disappearance into the forest, carrying treasure that she had reclaimed from the man who stole it, carries a symbolic weight that exceeds its material significance. She took back what was hers. She chose her own direction. She left the conqueror with nothing. Tuscaloosa, the towering chief who lured De Soto into the trap at Mabila, represents a different kind of indigenous response. Strategic resistance on a scale that nearly succeeded. His plan was sophisticated, patient, and coordinated across multiple communities. It required intelligence gathering, logistical preparation, the concealment of thousands of warriors inside a fortified town, and the discipline to maintain the appearance of cooperation until the trap was ready to spring. That the Battle of Mabila ended in the destruction of the town and the deaths of thousands of indigenous warriors does not diminish the strategic achievement of its conception. Tuscaloosa understood his enemy. He identified the Spanish vulnerability, the advance party entering the town while the main force waited outside, and he exploited it with a precision that a European military commander would have recognized and respected. That he lost does not mean he was outmatched. It means that Spanish technology, steel armor, cavalry, and above all the willingness to set fire to a town full of human beings overcame a plan that, against a less ruthlessly armed opponent, would have succeeded completely. The chief of Quigualtam, whose defiant response to De Soto's final demand for submission echoed across the Mississippi, represents yet another form of resistance, the simple, irreducible refusal to be intimidated. His message, that he visited no one, that others visited him, that he would retreat not one step, was the statement of a man who had assessed the threat and found it manageable. Whether he knew that De Soto was dying, or whether his defiance was based on a broader calculation of the expedition's weakness, the effect was the same. He denied the last conquistador the last submission he sought. De Soto died having been told no by a man he could not reach and could not punish. The river lay between them, and the river answered to neither. These indigenous responses, Cofitachequi's diplomacy, Tuscaloosa's strategic resistance, Quigualtam's defiance, and the thousands of unnamed acts of courage and suffering and adaptation that the chronicles mention only in passing or not at all, are as much a part of the expedition's legacy as De Soto's ambition and De Soto's failure. They are harder to document, they are harder to reconstruct, but they are not less real, and they are not less important. And any accounting of what happened in the southeastern interior between 1539 and 1543 that centers only on the Spanish perspective is not history, but hagiography with the names changed. The physical landscape itself bears the expedition's imprint in ways that are both visible and invisible. The route De Soto traveled crosses territory that is today occupied by major American cities: Tampa, Tallahassee, portions of Atlanta's suburban sprawl, Charlotte, the towns and cities of Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana. Interstate highways follow river valleys that De Soto's army followed on foot. Shopping centers and subdivisions sit on land where Mississippian mound centers once rose above cultivated fields. The connection is not metaphorical. The land remembers, even when the people who live on it do not. Archaeological work over the past century has identified probable locations of many of the expedition's camps and battle sites, though the precise route remains a subject of active and sometimes contentious scholarly debate. The difficulty lies in the nature of the evidence. A 16th century army on the march leaves a specific archaeological signature: Spanish artifacts, glass beads used in trade, iron fragments from weapons and tools, the bones of European pigs in contexts that predate later European settlement. These artifacts have been found at sites across the southeast, and each one anchors a point on the route. But the distances between points are large. The landscape has been transformed by 5 centuries of agriculture and development, and the chronicle's geographic descriptions are often vague enough to support multiple interpretations. The result is a scholarly literature that is rich, detailed, and perpetually contested, a mirror in its way of the expedition itself, which spent 4 years searching for certainty in a landscape that refused to provide it. One physical trace of the expedition deserves particular attention for what it reveals about the long arc of consequences. The pigs that De Soto's army drove through the southeast did not all end up as provisions. Many escaped. Many were traded to or seized by indigenous communities. They bred, they went feral, and within decades their descendants had spread across the southeastern forests, becoming one of the first populations of what would eventually be known as the American wild hog or feral pig, a species that now numbers in the millions across the southern United States, causing billions of dollars in agricultural damage annually, destroying habitat, competing with native wildlife, and resisting every attempt at eradication. The ecological footprint of De Soto's commissary herd is still expanding 5 centuries later across a landscape that has no mechanism for containing it. It is perhaps the expedition's most enduring physical legacy, a living, breathing, rooting reminder that the consequences of invasion do not end when the invaders leave. The story of Hernando de Soto raises questions about the nature of ambition that are not confined to the 16th century. The pattern he exemplified, the pursuit of wealth and glory beyond all rational calculation of cost, the inability to accept failure even when failure is the only honest assessment of the evidence, the willingness to destroy in pursuit of what cannot be found, is not unique to the age of conquest. It is a pattern that recurs wherever human beings mistake the intensity of their desire for evidence of its object's existence. De Soto believed in gold because he needed gold to exist. The strength of the need became, in his mind, proof of the supply. And when the supply failed to materialize, he did not adjust the need. He adjusted the map, pushing the imagined treasure beyond the next river, the next mountain, the next chiefdom, always just beyond the horizon of the verifiable. This is the pathology of the true believer, and it is more dangerous in a man with an army than in a man without one. A man who believes in phantom gold and has no power to pursue it is merely deluded. A man who believes in phantom gold and commands 600 soldiers, 200 horses, and the legal authority of the Spanish crown is a force of destruction on a continental scale. De Soto's delusion was not personal. It was armed. It was mounted. It was sanctioned by the most powerful empire on earth. And the distance between the delusion and the reality was measured not in miles, but in lives. The lives of his own soldiers who followed him into the wilderness and died there, and the lives of the indigenous people who did not choose to participate in his fantasy and who paid its price in blood and plague and the annihilation of everything they had built. The Mississippi River still flows past the place where De Soto died, though the river has shifted its course many times in the intervening centuries, and the exact spot is unknowable. The brown water still carries sediment from half a continent toward the Gulf. Uprooted trees still float in the current. The river is indifferent to what it holds: the body of a conquistador, the debris of a flood, the runoff of industrial agriculture, the memory of civilizations that rose along its banks and fell, and rose again in different forms. It does not remember Hernando de Soto. It does not need to. But we remember. And the question of what we do with that memory, and how we hold it, what we allow it to teach us, what we refuse to let it excuse, is not a question about the 16th century. It is a question about the nature of historical consciousness itself, about the obligations that the living owe to the dead, and about whether the stories we tell about the past serve to illuminate or to obscure the truths that the past insists on carrying forward into the present. There is a temptation, when confronting a figure like Hernando de Soto, to resolve the moral complexity into a verdict: guilty, condemned, monster. The evidence supports the charge. The mutilations, the enslavements, the burned villages, the war dogs unleashed on human beings, the systematic destruction of societies that had committed no offense except existing in territory that a foreign army wished to traverse. These are not ambiguous acts. They are crimes, measured by any moral framework that recognizes the humanity of their victims, and yet the verdict, satisfying as it might be, does not quite reach the thing that makes De Soto's story important. Monsters are easy. Monsters are aberrations, deviations from a norm that remains intact despite their existence. What makes De Soto disturbing is not that he was monstrous, but that he was ordinary. Ordinary within the system that produced him, ordinary in his ambitions, ordinary in his methods, ordinary in his conviction that what he wanted justified what he did to get it. He was the system working as designed, and the system was the monster. The Spain that produced Hernando de Soto was not a rogue state operating outside the norms of its era. It was the most powerful empire on earth, and its colonial enterprise was sanctioned by papal authority, codified in legal instruments, and supported by a theological framework that classified the conquest and conversion of non-Christian peoples as not merely permissible, but divinely mandated. The requerimiento, the legal document that Spanish conquistadors were required to read aloud to indigenous peoples before attacking them, a document written in a language the listeners did not speak, informing them that their lands now belonged to the Spanish crown and that resistance would be met with the full violence of a Christian army, was not a cynical joke, though it reads like one across the centuries. It was a sincere attempt to reconcile the mechanics of imperial conquest with the demands of Christian conscience, a document that reveals more about the moral architecture of the Spanish Empire than any chronicle of individual atrocity. The system had built a machine for the conversion of human beings into resources, their labor, their land, their gold, their bodies, and it had built, alongside that machine, a moral vocabulary that made the conversion seem not only acceptable, but righteous. De Soto operated this machine. He did not question its premises because its premises were the water he swam in, as invisible and as essential as the air he breathed. The indigenous people he encountered were, within his moral framework, subjects of the Spanish crown who had not yet been informed of their subjection, and whose resistance to that subjection, once informed, constituted rebellion against lawful authority. This framework was grotesque. It was also entirely sincere, held with the unreflective conviction of a man who had never been required to examine the foundations of his worldview because everyone around him shared them. The most dangerous moral failures are not the ones committed by people who know they are doing wrong. They are the ones committed by people who believe with perfect confidence that they are doing right or at least doing what is necessary, what is expected, what the world demands of a man in their position. This is why De Soto's story resonates beyond its historical moment. Not because the specific mechanisms of 16th century Spanish colonialism have modern equivalents, though some do in forms that would require their own reckoning, but because the underlying pattern is perennial, the conviction that one's own desires constitute a natural law, the belief that the intensity of an ambition justifies the cost of its pursuit, the inability to see the humanity of people who stand between the seeker and the sought, the moral framework that transforms exploitation into entitlement and violence into necessity. These are not artifacts of a vanished era. They are features of a species that has never quite learned to distinguish between what it wants and what it has the right to take. The survivors of the expedition carried their experience into the remainder of their lives in ways that the historical record captures only in fragments. The Gentleman of Elvas returned to Portugal and wrote his account, the fullest, most detailed chronicle of the expedition, and then vanished from history as completely as his anonymity throughout the narrative might have predicted. We do not know his name. We do not know when he died. We know only that he sat down at some point after his return and reconstructed, from memory and perhaps from notes, 4 years of suffering and failure and destruction, and that he did so with a narrative discipline and an observational precision that have made his account the single most valuable document in the historiography of the expedition. That he described atrocities without apparent moral discomfort does not mean he felt none. It may mean that the conventions of 16th century chronicle writing did not accommodate moral reflection on the treatment of indigenous peoples. It may mean that the experience had hardened him beyond the reach of retrospective conscience. It may mean something else entirely, something we cannot access across 5 centuries of cultural distance. His silence on the moral dimensions of what he witnessed is itself a kind of testimony. Evidence of a worldview so thoroughly constructed that the suffering of non-European peoples did not register as a category requiring explanation or justification. It simply was. Like the weather, like the terrain, like the river. Rodrigo Rangel, De Soto's secretary, returned to the colonial world and provided his testimony to Oviedo, whose incorporation of Rangel's journal into his larger history preserved details that would otherwise have been lost. Rangel's perspective was that of a functionary, a man whose professional obligation was to record rather than to interpret, and his account has the clinical quality of an official report. Distances measured, encounters catalogued, losses tallied. But even within this clinical framework, there are moments where something breaks through. His description of the aftermath of the Chickasaw fire, soldiers sitting in the ashes staring silent, carries an emotional weight that transcends its administrative context. He was recording what he saw, and what he saw was men who had been broken. Biedma, the royal factor, wrote the most condensed account, focused on the practical dimensions of the expedition, what was found, what was spent, what was lost. His report to the Crown was, in essence, an audit of a failed investment, and its language reflects the perspective of a man whose job was to assess value. The expedition, by Biedma's accounting, had produced no return on its considerable expenditure. The pearls from Cofitachequi, the only treasure of any kind the expedition had found, had been destroyed at Mabila. The territory traversed, while extensive, had yielded no resources that the Crown could exploit. The indigenous labor that had been extracted through force along the route had been consumed in the process of extraction, leaving nothing that could be taxed or tithed or incorporated into the imperial economy. Biedma's report was the financial autopsy of an enterprise that had been dead long before its commander stopped breathing. Garcilaso de la Vega, the Inca, wrote last and most lavishly, composing his account decades after the expedition's return, based on interviews with survivors whose memories had been shaped by time and by the human tendency to transform failure into something more bearable. His narrative is the most literary of the 4, the most willing to attribute noble motivations to the Spanish participants, and the most generous in its treatment of De Soto as a leader and a man. Garcilaso was himself a product of conquest, the son of a Spanish captain and an Inca princess, a man who lived between 2 worlds and whose writing was shaped by the desire to find dignity in both. His account of the De Soto expedition is not reliable in its details. It inflates numbers, invents speeches, and smooths the jagged edges of events that the other chroniclers report with greater rawness. But it preserves something the other accounts lack, a sense of the expedition as a human tragedy rather than merely a logistical failure. Garcilaso understood, from the intersection of his own bloodlines, what it meant for 2 worlds to collide and for the weaker to be shattered by the impact. His sympathy extended in both directions, toward the Spanish soldiers who suffered and died in the wilderness, and toward the indigenous peoples whose world was destroyed by their passage. This dual sympathy makes his account the most morally complex of the 4, even as its factual unreliability makes it the least trusted by modern scholars. Between these 4 voices, the story of the expedition has been preserved, debated, reinterpreted, and contested for nearly 500 years. Each generation of scholars has found in the chronicles a reflection of its own concerns. 19th century American historians writing in the era of manifest destiny treated De Soto as a heroic predecessor to the westward expansion of the United States, as a brave explorer who opened the interior of the continent to civilization. The narrative required certain omissions. The atrocities against indigenous peoples were minimized or attributed to the general roughness of the era. The failure to find gold was reframed as a successful exploration of unknown territory. De Soto was given statues. He was given parks. He was given a bridge over the Mississippi River that bears his name, connecting Arkansas and Tennessee at a crossing point not far from where his body entered the water. The irony is structural. The man who found nothing, who established nothing, who left behind only destruction and disease, was memorialized as a founder. 20th century scholarship began to dismantle this narrative, driven by advances in archaeology, by the growing influence of indigenous perspectives in historical writing, and by a broader willingness to confront the violence of the colonial enterprise on its own terms. The archaeological evidence was particularly devastating to the heroic interpretation. The population collapse documented at site after site across the Southeast could not be reconciled with a narrative that treated De Soto's expedition as a benign exploration. The abandoned mound centers, the empty villages, the demographic gap between the dense populations described in the Spanish chronicles and the sparse populations encountered by later European visitors, all of this pointed toward a catastrophe of staggering proportions, a catastrophe for which the expedition was, if not the sole cause, then the primary catalyst. The scholarly debates continue. The exact route of the expedition remains contested, with rival reconstructions differing by hundreds of miles in certain stretches. The population estimates for the pre-contact Southeast vary enormously, depending on the assumptions used to extrapolate from the archaeological evidence. The relative contributions of disease, warfare, enslavement, and social disruption to the overall population decline are weighted differently by different scholars. These are not trivial disputes. The answers matter, not just for academic purposes, but for the moral accounting that history demands. If the pre-contact population of the Southeast was 10 million, and if 90% of that population was destroyed in the century following De Soto's expedition, then the event ranks among the most catastrophic demographic disasters in human history. If the population was smaller and the decline less severe, the moral weight shifts, though it does not disappear because even the most conservative estimates describe the destruction of entire societies and the death of hundreds of thousands of human beings. What is not in dispute, what no serious scholar of any perspective contests, is that the world De Soto entered in 1539 was fundamentally different from the world that existed in that same territory a century later. Something happened in the interval, something enormous, something irreversible, something that erased civilizations and emptied landscapes and replaced a world of mound-building chiefdoms with a world of scattered remnant populations struggling to reconstitute themselves in the aftermath of catastrophe. De Soto's expedition was the event that initiated this transformation. Whether the transformation would have occurred eventually through other means, through later European contact, through the gradual diffusion of diseases from colonial settlements on the coast, is a counterfactual question that history cannot answer. What history can say with confidence is that De Soto brought the transformation to the interior Southeast when he did, how he did, and with the consequences that followed. The descendant communities of the peoples De Soto encountered are still here. The Muskogee Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Caddo, the Quapaw, and dozens of others. Nations that survived the demographic catastrophe of the 16th century, survived the colonial pressures of the 17th and 18th centuries, survived the forced removals of the 19th century, survived the assimilationist policies of the 20th century, and persist into the 21st as living cultures with living memories and living claims on the land and the history that De Soto's expedition tried to take from them. Their survival is not a footnote to the story, it is the story's most important chapter. the one the Spanish chronicles could not have written because it had not yet happened, and the one that no account of the expedition is complete without acknowledging. The destruction was real. The survival was also real. And the survival required a resilience and an adaptability that exceeded anything the conquistadors demonstrated in their 4 years of marching through a world they refused to understand. There is a moment near the end of the Gentleman of Elvas's chronicle that deserves to stand as the expedition's epitaph, not because it describes a dramatic event, but because it captures, in a single image, the distance between what De Soto sought and what the continent actually was. During the westward march under Moscoso after De Soto's death, the army passed through a territory where the land opened into wide grasslands and the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. The soldiers, accustomed to the dense forests of the southeast, found the openness disorienting. There were no landmarks. There were no rivers to follow. There were no paths worn by generations of indigenous travel. There was only grass moving in the wind like water, extending to a vanishing point that promised nothing except more of itself. The army marched into this openness and found, after days of walking, that they could not determine whether they were making progress or moving in circles. The landscape offered no evidence of either advance or retreat. It simply continued, vast and indifferent, absorbing the army's movement the way the ocean absorbs the wake of a ship, closing behind them, leaving no trace, offering no confirmation that their passage mattered. The soldiers stopped. They stood in the grass and looked at the horizon and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the continent was not going to give them what they wanted. Not because it was hostile, not because it was empty, but because what it contained, the richness of its soil, the complexity of its peoples, the depth of its rivers, the immensity of its spaces, existed on terms that had nothing to do with Spanish ambition and could not be translated into the vocabulary of conquest. The land was full. It was astonishingly, overwhelmingly full. But its fullness was expressed in corn and rivers and forests and societies that had spent centuries learning how to live within the specific demands of this specific place. It was not the fullness that De Soto recognized. It was not gold, and so he had called it nothing. The army turned around. It marched back to the Mississippi. It built its boats and floated toward the sea. The continent closed behind them like water. 5 centuries later, the Mississippi still runs. It still carries sediment from 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces toward the Gulf of Mexico, still floods its banks in spring, still shifts its channel with the slow, inexorable patience of a force that measures time in millennia rather than human lifetimes. Somewhere in its bed, dissolved beyond any possibility of recovery, are the minerals that once constituted the bones of Hernando de Soto. Calcium and phosphorus return to the chemistry of the river that has long since distributed them across the delta and into the Gulf and into the vast indifference of the sea. He is nowhere. He is everywhere the river has been, and the river has been everywhere.